My presentation was 40 minutes long. They spent 87 minutes deciding if George Stinney Jr. should live or die. Let me tell the story.
He was 2 years older than me. He weighed 95 pounds. And when they sat him in that chair, the chair they built to kill grown men, his feet didn't reach the floor. His name was George. George Stinney Jr. He was 14 years old. And the United States government strapped him into an electric chair and ended his life before he ever had a chance to become anything at all. Now I want you to picture something. Picture a night flight. The kind where most people are asleep, the cabin lights are turned down low, and the only sounds are the hum of the engine and the occasional clink of a drink being poured somewhere in the back. Picture the middle seat. Not the window, not the aisle, the middle seat, the one nobody wants, the one you get stuck in when you book late. That's where Marcus is sitting. Marcus is 12 years old. He has a worn backpack stuffed between his feet. He has a first-place ribbon pinned to the front of his jacket, blue and gold, the kind they give you at state competitions when you've stood in front of judges and proven that you know something worth knowing. He is tired in the good way, the way you're tired after you've worked hard and won. His folder of research sits in the seat pocket in front of him, tabbed and highlighted in 3 different colors. He has been working on this presentation for 4 months. He knows every date, every name, every document. And sitting next to him, in the aisle seat, is a man named Richard. 50 years old, well-dressed. The kind of man who always books the aisle seat because he likes to be able to leave. He has his arms folded. His eyes are forward. He has his headphones around his neck, but not in his ears, which means he doesn't actually want to listen to anything. He just wants to look like he does so nobody talks to him. He was not planning to talk to anyone tonight. But then the boy in the middle seat says something. Quietly, almost to himself. The words of someone who has been carrying a story all day and needs to finally let it out. He said his feet didn't reach the floor. And the man named Richard turns slowly and looks at this 12-year-old boy. And he asks, carefully, the way adults ask questions to children when they're not sure what world they've just walked into. What did you say? And Marcus looks at him.
Steady. Certain.
With the eyes of someone who has been preparing for exactly this conversation without knowing it. He says, I said his feet didn't reach the floor. His name was George. He was 14 years old. And America put him in an electric chair and killed him. You want to know the story? Richard doesn't say yes. But he doesn't look away. And Marcus begins. Now, before I go any further, if you have never heard the name George Stinney Jr., I need you to stay right here. I need you to not click away. I need you to give this story the time it deserves, because what happened to this child is one of the most important and devastating things that has ever happened on American soil, and the fact that most people have never heard his name is part of the crime. So stay with me. Stay with Marcus. Stay with this story all the way to the end, because I promise you, the ending will change something in you. And if you're new here, this channel exists for exactly this reason. To find the stories that got buried. To say the names that got erased. To make sure that the people who were stolen from history get put back in it. Hit that subscribe button right now, because we are just getting started and you do not want to miss what's coming.
Now,
let me take you to Alcolu, South Carolina. 1944. Let me show you the world George Stinney was born into. Before we go into Act 2, I want to ask you something. When you were 12 years old, what did you know about this story? Drop your answer in the comments. Because the fact that most of us never learned George Stinney's name in school, that silence is part of the story too. To understand what happened to George Stinney Jr., you have to understand the world he was born into. Not the sanitized, textbook version of it. The real version. The version that explains how an entire system, police, courts, lawyers, juries, judges, could look at a 14-year-old child and decide, in 87 minutes, that he had to die. The year is 1944. The United States of America is fighting a war on 2 sides of the planet. American soldiers, black and white, are dying on beaches in France and islands in the Pacific. The official story that America is selling to the world is that this is a war against fascism. A war against the idea that some human beings are worth less than others because of the group they were born into. That is what the posters say. That is what the speeches say. That is what the government tells the world. And at home, in South Carolina, there is a railroad track running through the middle of a small town called Alcolu. Not a metaphorical railroad track. A real one. Physical iron and wood running straight through the center of town, dividing it into two worlds that were never supposed to touch. On one side of those tracks, the white side of Alcolu. On the other side, the black side. Two worlds. One town. And a set of laws designed to make sure that those two worlds stayed exactly as separate as that railroad track insisted they should be. These were the Jim Crow laws. And if you don't know that name, let me make sure you understand what it meant to live inside them. Jim Crow meant that a black child could not drink from the same water fountain as a white child. It meant that a black family could not eat in the same restaurant, sleep in the same hotel, sit in the same section of a movie theater, or be buried in the same cemetery as their white neighbors. It meant that a black man had to step off the sidewalk if a white person was walking toward him. It meant that in a courtroom, the place where America says justice is supposed to be blind, a black citizen had no guarantee of being seen as fully human at all. Jim Crow was not a rumor. It was not history that happened somewhere else to someone else a long time ago.
It was the law.
Written down, enforced, with violence when necessary and paperwork when not. And Marcus explains all of this to Richard at 35,000 feet, and Richard sits in his aisle seat with his arms slowly unfolding and his body slowly turning, because something about the way a 12-year-old boy explains the architecture of American racism makes it impossible to look away from. Marcus tells Richard about the Stinney family. And this is the part one need you to really hear, because before George Stinney became a case number and a historical injustice and a name on an exoneration document, he was a person. He was a member of a family. He was loved. The Stinneys were a working family. George Stinney Sr. worked at a sawmill on the white side of Alcolu, one of the few black men in town with steady employment, which meant the family had slightly more stability than many of their neighbors. But stability in Jim Crow, South Carolina, was a fragile thing. It was the kind of stability that could disappear the moment a white man decided it should. George's mother kept the home. She kept the children. She kept the family woven together with the particular kind of strength that black mothers in the South had perfected over generations of having everything else taken from them. And the children. There were several Stinney children, a house full of the noise and motion that children make when they feel safe. Johnny, who was George's brother and his closest companion, and little Am, who was younger and who followed George everywhere because George was the kind of older sibling who never made you feel like a burden for following. George walked Am to school every morning. He didn't have to. Nobody assigned it to him. He just did it the way some children have a natural protectiveness toward the people they love that doesn't need to be taught or enforced. He simply understood that his little sister needed someone walking beside her, and so he walked beside her. He was, by every account that has survived the decades, a quiet boy. Not shy, there is a difference. Quiet in the way that some children are quiet because they are watching and thinking and storing things away. He loved the outdoors. He knew the fields around Alcolu the way children know places they've spent hundreds of hours in, intimately, specifically, the way that only comes from time and attention. He could tell you which plants grew where. He knew where the maypop flowers bloomed. He knew the paths between the fields. He knew the ditch at the edge of the woods. He was 14 years old, and he knew the names of flowers. That detail is going to matter. Remember it. Richard is leaning forward now. His headphones are gone entirely, tucked into the pocket of the seat in front of him. The businessman's armor, the folded arms, the forward gaze, the deliberate performance of unavailability, has been set aside completely. He is just a man on a plane listening to a child tell him something true. Marcus tells him about March 23, 1944. An ordinary Thursday afternoon. George and his brother Johnny are outside, the way teenagers are outside when the weather allows. Not doing anything in particular, just existing in the good loose way of people who don't yet know that ordinary afternoons are precious. And two girls come across the railroad tracks. Betty June Binnicker, 11 years old, and Mary Emma Thames, 8 years old. White girls from the other side of Alcolu, which means from the other side of everything. They come across the tracks, which already tells you something about who was allowed to cross and who wasn't, and they approach George and Johnny. They're looking for maypop flowers. It is the kind of errand only a child would be on, the kind of mission that seems important when you are 8 or 11 and you've decided that today is the day you find those flowers. They ask the brothers if they know where to find them. George does know. Of course he knows. He knows every inch of those fields. He points them toward the area near the woods, near the ditch at the edge of the property. And then he and Johnny turn and go home for dinner. That is the last ordinary thing George Stinney Jr. ever does in his life. He points 2 girls toward some flowers and walks home for dinner. And by the next morning, everything, every single thing about his life and his family's life and the future that was quietly waiting for him would be destroyed. If you're watching this and you're feeling something right now, that tightness in your chest, that thing that's making it hard to sit still, please subscribe to this channel. Because this is what we do here. We find the stories that should have never been forgotten, and we make sure they never get forgotten again. Subscribe right now and share this video, because George Stinney's name deserves to be in every home. And I want to ask you, what do you think George would have become if they had let him live? A doctor? A father? A teacher? Tell me in the comments. Because George never got to find out. But we can imagine it for him. The girls don't come home. That evening, as the sun goes down over Alcolu and families sit down to dinner and children are called in from yards and porches, Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames do not come home. Their families begin to worry, in the way families worry when the light is gone and someone small is still outside. By nightfall, the worry is turned into something larger and louder and more desperate. Search parties form. Neighbors gather. The white side of Alcolu mobilizes in the way that white communities in the Jim Crow South mobilized when one of their own was in danger, completely, immediately, and with the full expectation that whatever resources existed would be directed toward them. The Stinney family on the other side of the tracks knows nothing of this yet. George has had his dinner. He has probably done the things 14-year-old boys do in the evening, talked to Johnny, maybe helped clear the table, maybe sat outside for a while before bed. He has no reason to feel afraid. He pointed 2 girls toward some flowers. He went home. That is the entire sum of his involvement in anything that happened that day. The following morning, the girls are found. Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames are found in a ditch, near the edge of the woods, the same area where George had pointed. They have been murdered. They are 11 years old and 8 years old, and they are dead in a ditch in South Carolina, and this is a tragedy. A genuine, heartbreaking tragedy that deserves to be named as such. 2 children are dead. 2 families are destroyed. And in a just world, what would follow is a careful, thorough, evidence-based investigation designed to find the person actually responsible for this crime. This is not a just world. Not in Alcolu, South Carolina, in 1944. Not on the black side of the railroad tracks. Within hours, Marcus repeats this to Richard, and we are going to repeat it here because it is the detail that cracks the whole thing open. Within hours of the girls being found, police arrive at the Stinney home. Not the next day. Not after a week of investigation. Not after forensic evidence is gathered and witnesses are interviewed and leads are followed, and the actual mechanics of determining guilt are applied. Within hours. The same morning the bodies are found. Before the ground has had time to dry around that ditch. Before anyone has had time to do anything that resembles a real investigation. They come for George. And the reason, the entire reason, the complete and total basis upon which a 14-year-old child is taken from his home and accused of double murder, is this. Someone said George was the last person seen near the girls. That is it. That is the case. That is the evidence. Not physical evidence. Not forensic evidence. Not a witness who saw anything happen. Just a statement that George had been in the area near the girls at some point during the day. Which was true. He had been. He had pointed them toward the flowers and gone home for dinner. But in Alcolu, South Carolina, in 1944, on the white side of the railroad tracks, the fact that a black boy had been near 2 white girls who were later found dead was not the beginning of an investigation. It was the conclusion of one. George Stinney is taken. And then the police do something that Marcus explains to Richard in a voice that does not waver, because Marcus has read this part of the record so many times that he has moved through shock into something colder and more permanent. They tell the Stinney family to leave. Not in those gentle words. Not with any of the softness that word leave implies. They tell George's parents, in terms that are clear enough that no translation is needed, that if the family remains in Alcolu, the mob that is gathering on the white side of the tracks will come for them. All of them, not just George.
The whole family.
And so George Stinney Sr. and his wife gather their children, all of them except the one who has already been taken, and they pack what they can carry. They leave their home. They leave Alcolu. They leave South Carolina. They go to relatives in another state, and they do not come back. They leave their 14-year-old son behind. I need you to stay with that for a moment. I need you to feel the full weight of what that means, not as a judgment of the Stinney parents, but as an indictment of a system so violent and so complete that it could force a mother and father to choose between staying and dying or leaving and abandoning. There was no third option. There was no authority they could appeal to. There was no lawyer they could call. There was no newspaper that would print their story. There was no court they could walk into and say, "You have our child and you have no right to him." There was nothing. There was only the threat of the mob and the image of their son in a jail cell 50 miles away, and the terrible mathematics of survival that told them if they stayed, more of their children would die. So they left. George Stinney sits in a cell 50 miles from home. He is 14 years old. He weighs 95 pounds. He has never been in a jail before. He does not have a lawyer. He does not have his parents. He does not have anyone. He is completely, entirely, terrifyingly alone. And the machine is just beginning to move. Richard, sitting in his aisle seat at 35,000 feet, has been quiet for a long time. His jaw is set. His hands are flat on his knees. He is a 50-year-old man who has been alive long enough to know the rough geography of American history, but knowing the geography and hearing a 12-year-old boy describe a child being separated from his family at 14 and left alone in a cell, those are different experiences. The knowing and the hearing are different things. He asks Marcus, "Was there anyone? Was there anyone at all who tried to help him?" Marcus looks at him, and the answer he gives is the one that breaks the story open completely. He says, "They gave him a lawyer." And the way he says it tells you everything before he explains it. Subscribe to this channel right now if you believe that George Stinney's story deserves to be heard by every single person on this planet. Share this video. Put it on your page.
Send it to someone.
Because the only way stories like this survive is if people like you refuse to let them disappear.
Subscribe.
And keep watching. I want to know, when Marcus tells Richard that George was left completely alone in that jail cell, Richard goes quiet. What do you think was going through Richard's mind in that moment? Tell me in the comments below. The lawyer's name was Charles Plowden. Charles Plowden was not a criminal defense attorney. He was not a man who had spent years studying how to defend the accused, how to challenge evidence, how to cross-examine witnesses, how to find the holes in a prosecution's case, and pull until the whole thing unraveled. Charles Plowden was a tax commissioner. His expertise was property taxes. His professional life revolved around paperwork about land values and assessment rates, and the bureaucratic architecture of municipal finance. He was appointed to defend George Stinney Jr.'s life. He met George briefly. He prepared nothing. He had, by any reasonable measure, neither the training, the experience, nor, and the record suggests this clearly, the motivation to mount any kind of real defense for a black child accused of murdering 2 white girls in Jim Crow, South Carolina. Whether that lack of motivation came from fear, from indifference, from the ambient racism of the time and place, or from some combination of all three, the result was the same. George Stinney had a lawyer in the technical sense only, a man with that title who appeared in the courtroom and occupied that space. What he did not have was an advocate. What he did not have was someone whose purpose was to fight for him. But before the trial, there is the confession. And the confession is where the entire manufactured case against George Stinney is built. 2 officers, a jail cell, a 14-year-old boy, alone. According to those 2 officers, George confessed to the murders of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames during their interrogation. According to those 2 officers, he admitted everything, provided details, confirmed guilt. There is no written record of this confession. There is no document with George's signature. There is no third party who witnessed the interrogation. There is no record of what was said to George before he allegedly confessed. No record of what was threatened, what was promised, what a terrified 14-year-old who had been separated from his family and locked in a cell for weeks might say to two grown men in authority who had complete and total power over every aspect of his existence. There is only the word of two officers. And in Alcolu, South Carolina, in 1944, the word of two white officers about what a black child said in a room with no witnesses was, for the purposes of the justice system, sufficient. The trial is set. April 24, 1944. Less than a month after George's arrest. The courthouse in Manning, South Carolina. The seat of Clarendon County. A building that was built to represent the law. A building with columns and steps and the architecture of authority. The kind of building designed to make you feel, when you walk up those steps, that what happens inside is serious and deliberate and just. Black citizens are not permitted in the courtroom. George Stinney Jr. is brought in. He is small, so visibly, heartbreakingly small, in a room full of men who are not. He is wearing clothes. He is breathing. He is alive and present, and there. He is a child. Anyone in that room who looked at him and saw anything other than a child had made a prior decision about what they were willing to see. The jury is selected. All white. Every single one. The judge presides. His name is on the record. His name is in Marcus's research folder, tabbed and highlighted. We'll come back to that name. The prosecution presents its case. Two white officers testify about the confession they say they took, the confession with no documentation, no witnesses, no paper record of any kind. Some physical evidence is presented, though forensic science in 1944 is nothing like what it would later become, and what is presented is thin and circumstantial, and would not survive meaningful scrutiny. The prosecution argues that George, having been near the girls that afternoon, having allegedly confessed, is guilty. Charles Plowden, the tax commissioner, presents the defense. He calls no witnesses. He presents no evidence. He makes no real argument. He does not challenge the confession. He does not question the lack of documentation. He does not point out that his client is a 14-year-old child who is interrogated alone without counsel. He does not present an alibi, though one exists, though it is sitting at home right now in the person of George's little sister Am, who was with her brother that day and who would not be asked about this for another 70 years. He does not do any of the things that a lawyer is supposed to do when a child's life is on trial. The trial lasts 87 minutes. Marcus holds up both hands when he says this to Richard, and the gesture is important. He holds up both hands because he wants the number to be visible, physical, real. He wants Richard to see it in the air between them and not just hear it. 87 minutes. My presentation today, Marcus says, was 40 minutes long. I stood in front of 5 judges, and I talked about George Stinney for 40 minutes. They spent 87 minutes deciding whether George Stinney should live or die. Less than twice the length of a middle school presentation. Less time than it takes to watch a movie. Less time than most people spend at a restaurant waiting for food and eating it and paying the bill. 87 minutes. For a child's life. The jury deliberates for 10 minutes. 10 minutes. In the history of American jurisprudence, there are countless cases where juries have deliberated for days. For weeks. Cases where the weight of the decision keeps people in a room together arguing and reasoning and sitting with the gravity of what they've been asked to do. Cases where jurors go home and come back and go home again because they understand that they are holding a human life in their hands and the seriousness of that cannot be rushed. These 12 men deliberate for 10 minutes. They return with a verdict.
Guilty.
Death by electric chair. George Stinney Jr. learns his fate in that courtroom. He is 14 years old. He is 95 pounds. He is wearing clothes that fit him and breathing air that is about to become very precious and looking at a room full of men who have just decided that he will not grow up. What does a 14-year-old boy do with that information? What does any child do when the full machinery of an adult world turns toward them and announces, with all the procedural ceremony and legal architecture of a functioning society, that you are going to die? The record does not tell us much about what George said or did in that moment. It does not give us the luxury of knowing what his face looked like or what his hands did or whether he cried or went still or looked for someone in the room who might save him. What we know is that he had a Bible. He carried it with him everywhere after the verdict. In a world that had taken his family and his freedom and now his future, the Bible was the only thing that remained. He held on to it. Richard is gripping the armrest between them. His knuckles are white. He has stopped performing composure entirely. He is just a man who is hearing something terrible and has no defense against it. He asks Marcus, "How old are you?" 12, Marcus says. Richard looks at him. At this 12-year-old boy with a first-place ribbon and a folder full of truth. He says, "You're telling this story at 12 years old." And Marcus says, "George was 14 when they killed him. Somebody should." The cabin hums around them. A flight attendant walks past with a trolley. Somewhere in the rows behind them, a child laughs at something on a screen. The sounds of ordinary life, ordinary survival, ordinary Tuesday evening, all of it happening in the same air as the story. Richard closes his eyes for a moment.
Just a moment.
Then he opens them and says, "What happened next?" And Marcus turns the page in his mind. If this story is making you feel something right now, something that won't let you sit still, something that feels like it deserves more than a private reaction, please subscribe to this channel and share this video.
Right now.
Not after.
Now.
Because George Stinney was convicted in 87 minutes and exonerated in none of the history books most of us were handed. Let's change that. Subscribe and share. Here's my question for you this act. The jury took 10 minutes to condemn a child to death. 10 minutes. What does that tell you about what that jury believed before they ever walked into that courtroom? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts. 81 days after his arrest. 47 days after his conviction. George Stinney Jr. wakes up in his cell at the South Carolina State Penitentiary in Columbia. He is 14 years old today in the same way he was 14 years old yesterday, which is to say he is exactly as young as he has always been, exactly as small, exactly as much a child. Nothing about him has changed. The calendar has moved and the date has arrived and the machinery of execution is prepared and running, but George himself is unchanged. He is still the boy who walked his sister to school. He is still the boy who knew the names of flowers. He is still someone's son, someone's brother, someone's neighbor, someone's future. He carries his Bible. It is the only thing he owns in this building. In this entire enormous institutional building with its guards and its cells and its procedures and its electric chair built for adult men. In all of it, the only thing that belongs to George Stinney is a Bible. Small enough to hold in both hands. Worn enough to have been read many times. The kind of object that becomes, when everything else is stripped away, not just a book, but an anchor. Something to hold. Something that holds back. He walks to the execution chamber. He is accompanied by guards who are larger than him. He is dressed in clothes. He is walking on his own legs, which means he is making, step by step, the most terrible journey any person can make, toward the end of their own life. And he is 14 years old. And nobody who loves him is there. His mother is not there. His father is not there. Johnny is not there. Little Am, who he walked to school every morning, who followed him everywhere because he made her feel safe, she is not there. He walks that walk alone. The execution chamber is a room. It has walls and a floor and a ceiling, and in the center of it, the chair. The chair is not designed for George. The chair was designed for adult men, full-grown, fully developed men who committed crimes as adults and were tried as adults and sentenced as adults. The proportions of the chair assume a body that George does not have. The restraints are too large. The electrodes don't fit properly around the head of a child whose skull is smaller than the chair's engineering assumed. They adjust what they can. They do what they can to make the equipment work on a body it was never meant for. His feet don't reach the floor. Marcus says this to Richard quietly. He says it the same way he said it at the very beginning of the flight, in those first words that pulled Richard out of his deliberate silence and into the story. His feet don't reach the floor. And the reason Marcus comes back to this detail, the reason this detail is the one that opens the story and lives in the heart of it, is because it is the one image that makes the abstraction of injustice completely, viscerally, undeniably real. You can hear statistics and not feel them. You can hear about trials and verdicts and legal procedures and stay in your head. But a child in a chair with his feet not reaching the floor, that you feel in your body, that you cannot think your way around. The mask is placed over his face. It doesn't fit properly either. It shifts. It slips. The Bible is in his hands. There is some dispute in the historical record about whether he held it throughout or whether it was taken from him, but what is agreed upon is that he had it with him. He brought it. It was his. The witnesses are present. Officials. Personnel. The people who are there, because procedure requires their presence. No family. No one who came because they love him and cannot let him go alone. The execution takes less than 10 minutes. George Stinney Jr. is pronounced dead at 7:30 in the evening. He has been alive for 14 years, 7 months, and 26 days. He weighs, at the time of his death, 95 pounds, less than the machine that kills him, some accounts suggest. He is, at the moment of his execution, the youngest person to be put to death in the United States in the 20th century. That record will stand. It will stand because even a country that has executed people throughout its history reaches a point where executing a child this young becomes a marker, the floor of something, the boundary of something, and no one will go below it. No one else will be George Stinney. But there was one George Stinney, and he was real, and he was 14. And his feet didn't reach the floor. Marcus stops talking. The airplane hums. Outside the window, the sky is completely dark, the kind of dark that exists only at altitude, where the lights of civilization are too far below to reach. Richard is looking straight ahead. He has not moved. He is sitting in his aisle seat with his hands pressed flat against his thighs and his jaw set, and his eyes doing something complicated. After a long time, he says, "Was there anyone? Was anyone ever held accountable?" And Marcus says, "That's the part that takes 70 years. But it comes. It comes." And something in Richard's face shifts. Something moves through him that Marcus can see, but cannot yet name. Something that looks, from a certain angle, like a man preparing to tell the truth. Please subscribe to this channel and share this video right now. Not because I'm asking you to support a channel, but because George Stinney Jr. deserved a world that would not let his story disappear. Every share is a refusal to let him disappear. Every subscriber is someone who will carry his name forward.
Subscribe. Share. Do it now.
George walked to that execution chamber alone. No family. No one who loved him. Just a Bible and 14 years of life ending in a room that wasn't built for him. Tell me in the comments, what would you have wanted to say to George Stinney if you could have been in that room with him? The world moved on. That is the thing about institutional injustice that makes it so enduring and so difficult to confront. The world moves on. The execution happens, the paperwork is filed, the case is closed, and the machinery of ordinary life resumes its motion. People have breakfast. Children go to school. Courts handle other cases. Officers work other shifts. Lawyers deal with other matters. The newspapers that mention George's arrest and trial and execution move on to other stories, other tragedies, other injustices, an endless supply of material in a country that produces injustice the way it produces everything else, abundantly, efficiently, and with the full confidence of a system that believes in itself. George Stinney Jr. is buried. His family, scattered and displaced, grieves in private. His sister carries him with her for the rest of her life, not loudly, not publicly, but the way people carry the dead they could not save. Quietly, internally, with a weight that doesn't diminish but becomes, over time, simply part of the architecture of who you are. For decades, George Stinney Jr. is a name that almost nobody knows. He is not in the history books. He is not in the curriculum. He is not in the national conversation about justice and injustice and what America owes to the people it has harmed. He is in the memories of his family and in the records of the South Carolina State Penitentiary and in the minds of a handful of researchers who stumble across his case and feel the ground shift under them. And then, slowly, people start to pull at the threads. In the decades after 1944, as the civil rights movement rises and falls and rises again, and the country is forced, again and again, to reckon with what it has done and what it continues to do, historians and journalists and researchers begin to excavate. They go through old court records. They read old newspapers. They find cases that were closed and ask, should these have been closed? They find convictions and ask, were these just? They find names that got erased and ask, why were these erased and who benefited from the erasing? And somebody finds George. Somebody pulls out the record of a 1944 murder trial in Clarendon County, South Carolina, that lasted 87 minutes and ended in the execution of a 14-year-old boy, and they read it carefully, and they feel what everyone feels when they read it carefully, the cold, clarifying shock of something that cannot be explained away. You can look at the record of George Stinney's trial and find no interpretation under which it resembles justice. There is no angle, no context, no historical framing that makes 87 minutes and a 10-minute jury deliberation and zero evidence and a tax commissioner for a lawyer look like a functioning legal system doing its job. It looks like what it was: a murder with paperwork. And so the questions begin. Researchers begin interviewing survivors. They find people who were in Alcolu in 1944. They find people who remember the Stinney family. They find people who remember George. And one of those people, one of the most important people in this entire story, is still alive. Am Stinney, George's little sister. The girl he walked to school every morning. The girl who followed him everywhere. The girl who was with him on the afternoon of March 23, 1944, when the world was still ordinary and the flowers were still growing in the fields and the future still existed. Am Stinney, now elderly, white-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who has carried something enormous for a very long time, gives her testimony. She says clearly and without hesitation, George was at home with her when the murders happened. He was not in the woods. He was not near the ditch. He was home. With her. He had an alibi. He had an alibi the entire time. A complete, clear, human alibi. His sister, who was with him, who knew where he was, who could have stood in that courtroom in 1944 and said exactly what she is saying now. Nobody asked her. Nobody came to the Stinney home and said, "Where was George that afternoon?
Who was he with?
Can anyone account for his movements?" Nobody asked. And Marcus explains this to Richard with a kind of controlled fury that is more powerful than outrage would be. The fury of someone who has sat with this fact long enough to understand what it means. George Stinney had an alibi that was never used because no one with the power to use it cared enough to find it. Because the decision about George's guilt was made before the investigation started. Because in 1944 in South Carolina, for a black boy accused of harming white girls, the question was never whether he did it. The question was only how quickly the paperwork could be completed. Forensic analysts review what physical evidence survives. They find problems. The timeline of the crime, when examined carefully, does not support the conclusion that George acted alone or that he was present at the scene during the critical window. The physical evidence, thin as it was in 1944, does not hold up under modern scrutiny. The story the prosecution told, the story that a jury accepted in 10 minutes, has holes in it large enough to drive the entire case through. And the confession that was the keystone of the prosecution's case. The two officers, the cell, the no witnesses, the no documentation, the no record of any kind. Experts in interrogation and false confessions, a field that has grown substantially in the decades since 1944 as researchers have documented how often innocent people confess to things they did not do, especially children, especially under duress, especially when isolated and frightened and completely without support. Look at what the record says and conclude what anyone paying attention already suspects. A 14-year-old boy, alone in a cell, separated from his family, facing the full and terrifying authority of two police officers in a system that had already decided his guilt, may well have said whatever those officers needed him to say. Not because he did it, because he was a child. And children, when the adults in authority over them make clear what answer is required, often give that answer. The case for George Stinney's guilt, examined honestly, is not a case. It is a series of assumptions dressed up in legal procedure. It is a conclusion that was reached before the process started, with the process retrofitted around it. In 2014, a South Carolina judge named Carmen Mullen takes up the case. She reviews everything. She reads the trial record and the evidence and the statements and the decades of research. She issues her ruling. The conviction of George Stinney Jr. is vacated. The trial is ruled fundamentally unfair. His name is cleared. 70 years later. He has been dead for 70 years when the state of South Carolina finally admits that what it did to him was not justice. He is not alive to hear it. He cannot walk out of a cell and breathe free air and call his family and say, "They finally told the truth." He cannot have the years back. He cannot become what he might have become. He cannot know, but his family knows. Am Stinney, in her 80s, is in the courtroom when the verdict is vacated. She is there with other surviving siblings and family members, people who have been carrying George for their entire lives, carrying him in the particular way that families carry the people they lost too young and too unjustly, as a presence that never fully left, as a name that was always said with a specific kind of weight, as an absence shaped exactly like a person. They weep, not the soft weeping of sadness, the weeping of people who have been told, after a lifetime of waiting, that they were right, that what happened was wrong, that George was innocent, that George was stolen, that the system that took him failed him completely, and the country knows it now, officially, legally, with a judge's ruling and a court record, and the full weight of the law turned, for the first time, toward truth instead of away from it. Marcus tells Richard this, and his voice is different in this part, not louder, but fuller. There is something in the exoneration that gives him back something. The story of George Stinney is a story of almost total loss, the loss of a child, the loss of a future, the loss of a family's wholeness, the loss of decades of truth. But the exoneration is the place where the story insists on meaning anyway, where the story says it was not nothing, it was not invisible, it was not permanently buried. Someone dug it up, someone told it, and Richard is listening. He has been listening for a long time. And now he asks the question that Marcus doesn't expect. He says, "What was the judge's name?" The original judge. The one who presided over the 1944 trial. Marcus reaches into his backpack. His research folder.
Tapped.
Highlighted. For months of work. He flips to the page. He reads the name. He looks up. Richard's face has gone the color of the clouds outside the window. Marcus says, "Do you know that name?" And Richard says, "Say it again." Marcus says it again. And Richard closes his eyes. Subscribe to this channel right now, because we are seconds away from the moment this entire flight has been building toward. And you need to be here for it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. I want to ask you, when Marcus reads the judge's name and Richard's face changes, what do you think Richard is feeling in that moment? Not what he's thinking, what he's feeling. Tell me in the comments. Richard doesn't speak for a long time. The airplane hums. The cabin is quiet the way late-night flights are quiet. Most passengers asleep, the overhead lights dimmed, the world outside reduced to darkness, and the blinking light on the wing. The flight attendants have retreated to their stations. The world has contracted to 2 seats in the middle of the plane. A 12-year-old boy with a first-place ribbon, and a 50-year-old man with his eyes closed and something enormous moving through him. When Richard opens his eyes, he reaches into the inside pocket of his jacket. He removes his wallet. Brown leather, worn at the corners in the way that wallets get worn when they've been carried for years, when they've been in the same pocket through hundreds of ordinary days and a few extraordinary ones. He opens it. Behind his credit cards, behind the ordinary material of a functional life, there is a piece of paper, folded many times, soft at the creases from the particular handling of something that has been taken out and looked at and put back many, many times. He unfolds it carefully, the way you unfold something you don't want to damage, the way you handle something that matters. It is a family tree, handwritten, 4 generations. Names and dates in neat cursive, the kind of document that someone made carefully because they understood that names and dates are the architecture of identity, the proof that people existed, the evidence that someone came before you and shaped the world you walked into. Richard holds it out. Marcus takes it, looks at it, and near the top of the document, among the names of people who lived and died before he was born, before his parents were born, before almost anyone alive today was born, he finds a name. The same name he just read from his research folder. He looks up at Richard. His voice, when he speaks, is careful. Because Marcus is 12 years old, and he's been telling this story for an hour, and he knows every part of it. But this part is new. This part is not in any document he researched. This part is happening now on this plane in the middle of the night, and it is requiring him to think faster than a competition has ever required him to think. He says, "That's the judge." And Richard says, "That's my great-grandfather." The cabin hums. Somewhere 2 rows back, someone shifts in their seat, and the leather creaks and goes silent again. Marcus holds the family tree and looks at it and looks at Richard and processes what he is holding. He is holding the genealogy of the man who sentenced George Stinney Jr. to death. He is holding the family history of the judge who sat in that courtroom in Manning, South Carolina, in 1944, who presided over an 87-minute trial, who watched a 10-minute jury deliberation, who accepted a verdict of guilty against a 14-year-old child with no real evidence and no real defense, and who signed the paperwork that sent that child to the electric chair. He is sitting next to that judge's great-grandson. And Richard is looking at him, at this 12-year-old boy, this child who has just spent the better part of a night flight explaining to a stranger what his own family did, with an expression that is not simple. It is not guilt alone, though guilt is there. It is not grief alone, though grief is there. It is not shame alone, though shame is visible in it. It is the expression of a man who has been carrying a piece of a story without knowing what story it belonged to, and who has just, in the course of a night flight next to a child with a first-place ribbon, found out. He tells Marcus what his father told him. Before his father died, Richard says he pulled him aside. His father was a man who did not talk about the past easily, who wore his family history the way some people wear a coat that doesn't quite fit, always a little uncomfortable, always slightly off. He told Richard that there was a stain on the family.
He used that word, stain.
He said, "Our family has a stain that nobody talked about. I don't know everything, but I know it involves your great-grandfather. I know it involves a judgment he made. And I know that if you ever want to understand what kind of man you want to be, you need to find out what that judgment was." His father died, without telling him more. Richard has spent years since then trying to find out. He has gone through old records. He has searched databases. He has contacted historical societies and legal archives and libraries. He has been, in the way of a man trying to reckon honestly with something he cannot yet name, following the thread his father left him. Find the judge, find the judgment, find the stain. He was on his way to South Carolina when he boarded this plane. He was going to Alcolu. He was going to find the records. He did not expect to find a 12-year-old boy in the middle seat with a research folder who had already found everything. Marcus is very still while Richard tells him this. He is processing something that has no category in a 12-year-old's experience, the moment when a story you have been telling turns out to also be the story of the person you have been telling it to. The moment when the research becomes personal in a direction you didn't anticipate. He has spent 4 months learning everything there is to know about what happened to George Stinney Jr. He has learned the names of the officers, and the lawyer, and the judge. He has put those names in a folder and highlighted them in 3 colors. He has stood in front of 5 judges at a state history competition and said those names out loud. He did not expect one of those names to reach back. He did not expect to be sitting next to the past. But here they are. And Marcus is 12 years old, and he has a first-place ribbon, and he has been telling hard truths to a stranger all night, and he does not stop now. He looks at Richard with the steady, undeceived eyes of a child who has spent 4 months looking at what adults do to children when they decide some children don't count, and he says, "Your great-grandfather had a chance. Not just to do justice, though there was that. Not just to look at a 14-year-old boy in a courtroom and see a child, though there was that too. He had a chance to be the person who said no, who looked at 87 minutes and 10 minutes of deliberation and said, 'This is not a trial, this is a performance, and I will not be the one who signs the ending.' He had a chance to be the judge who stopped it, who demanded more time, more evidence, more defense, more of the things that justice is supposed to require before a child's life is taken from him. He didn't take that chance. Richard is looking at his family tree. His great-grandfather's name in neat cursive, a name that was written by someone who loved that man, who thought he was worth recording, who wanted his name to persist, who had no idea that 70-some years later, on a night flight at 35,000 feet, a 12-year-old black boy would read that name from a research folder, and a 50-year-old white man would feel the floor of his understanding shift beneath him. He folds the family tree, places it back in his wallet.
Carefully.
The way you return something to its place when you know you will need to keep looking at it. Then he turns to Marcus and he says, "May I see the folder?" And Marcus, this child, this 12-year-old boy who walked onto a plane this afternoon with a ribbon and a competition win and came away with something much larger and more complicated than either of those things, reaches into the seat pocket in front of him and takes out the folder. His 4 months of work, his 3 colors of highlighting, his tabs and his dates and his names and his evidence. He slides it across. Richard takes it with both hands. He opens it to the first page. He reads. He turns pages slowly, reading everything. His name, the name his family carries, the name that appears on the family tree in neat cursive, appears in the documents. In the official capacity of a judge. In the record of a trial that lasted 87 minutes. In the signature on a death warrant for a child who was 14 years old and weighed 95 pounds and had an alibi that nobody asked about. He reads for a long time. When he closes the folder, he holds it for a moment with both hands, the way Marcus held it, the way you hold something that is both ordinary, paper, ink, a manila folder with color tabs, and completely extraordinary. He says his name was George. Not a question. A commitment. The way you say a name when you are deciding to carry it. Marcus says, George Stinney Jr. born October 21, 1929. Executed June 16, 1944. Exonerated December 17, 2014. You should know the whole name. Richard says it. The whole name. Quietly. George Stinney Jr., like he is writing it somewhere inside himself, where it will not be lost. And Marcus watches him say it, and feels something that is not quite victory, and not quite peace, but something in the neighborhood of both. The feeling of a story landing where it needed to land, of a name reaching someone who needed to hear it, of truth doing the slow and necessary work that truth does when it is finally told to the right person. Subscribe to this channel. Not for the algorithm. Not for the numbers. Subscribe because this is what it means to face history honestly, a 12-year-old boy and a 50-year-old man on a night flight, choosing not to look away. Subscribe, share this video, and make sure George Stinney's name travels further than it ever has before. Richard just said George's full name out loud. For the first time in his life, he knows who his family hurt. What do you think he should do next? What does accountability look like for someone in Richard's position? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. The seatbelt sign comes on. The pilot's voice comes over the intercom, the calm, practiced voice of someone who has announced descent hundreds of times, who has said these same words so often they have become almost musical. Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We'll be on the ground shortly. The cabin stirs. People shift and wake and reach for bags and rub their eyes and begin the small preparations of arrival. The ordinary mechanics of a flight ending, of a journey completing itself, of people becoming, once again, people with destinations and purposes and places to be. Marcus and Richard do not move. They sit in the returning noise of the waking cabin the way people sit when they are inside something that the world around them doesn't know about, quietly, with a stillness that is not passivity but its opposite, the stillness of two people who have just been through something and are not yet ready to let it go. Richard still has the research folder in his hands. He has been holding it since Marcus gave it to him, and he has not given it back, and neither of them has said anything about this, and the not saying is its own kind of conversation.
He looks at it now.
He looks at the tabs and the highlighting and the months of work that a 12-year-old boy put into understanding something that Richard's own family had spent decades not understanding, not talking about, not confronting. He thinks about his father, about the word stain. About a man on his deathbed leaving his son a thread to follow because he could not bear to say the thing directly, but could not bear to take it to his grave unsaid. He thinks about the courtroom in 1944, about his great-grandfather in the judge's seat, about what it would have taken, what quality of moral courage, what willingness to stand against the current of everything the time and place demanded, to look at an 87-minute trial and say no, to look at a 10-minute verdict and say no. To look at a 14-year-old child in a chair built for adult men and say, not on my authority, not with my signature. He thinks about what it would have cost. And he thinks about what it costs not to. He turns to Marcus. He says, I'm going to Alcolu.
Still.
I was going before, and I'm still going. Marcus nods. He says, I want to find his grave. I want to stand at it. I don't know if that changes anything. I don't know if standing at a grave does anything for the person in it. But I think he pauses.
Breathes.
Starts again. I think it does something for the person standing there. I think some things need to be witnessed, even when the witnessing is late. Even when it comes 70 years after the fact and can't give back anything that was taken. Marcus is quiet for a moment. Then he says his sister said he loved flowers. Richard looks at him. Maypop flowers, Marcus says. He knew where they grew. He liked them. Something crosses Richard's face. Something that is very close to a man deciding to carry something. Not put it down. Not pass it to someone else. Carry it. He says, I'll bring some. They sit with that for a moment. The city lights are visible now through the windows. The grid of streets and neighborhoods and lives. All of it lit up and spreading out beneath the plane as it descends. The lights of a world that continued after George Stinney. That went on having its ordinary days and its seasons and its small joys and its arguments and its breakfasts and its bedtimes. A world that mostly forgot him. That had the luxury of forgetting him because it was never asked to remember. Richard carefully slides the research folder back across to Marcus. Marcus takes it. But before he puts it back in the seat pocket, he opens it to the page with George's name at the top. The full name, the dates, the exoneration. He slides that single page back. He says, keep that one. Richard takes it, holds it. He says, how old did you say you were? 12, Marcus says. Richard shakes his head slowly. Not in dismissal, in something that is much closer to wonder. The specific wonder of an adult confronted with a particular kind of courage that children sometimes have, the kind that comes from not yet having learned all the reasons that honesty is supposed to be complicated, all the social calculations that adults make before they decide whether the truth is worth the cost of telling it. He says, you're going to do something with your life. Marcus looks at him with the steady, unhurried eyes that he has had throughout this entire flight. And he says, so was George. The wheels touch down. The runway lights blur past the windows. The engines reverse. The plane slows from the impossible speed of flight to the ordinary speed of taxiing, of becoming earthbound again, of rejoining the world at ground level. The seatbelt sign goes off with its familiar chime, and the cabin comes fully alive. The percussion of overhead bins opening and closing, the shuffle of bags and coats and carry-ons being retrieved, the surge of voices and phones, and the sounds of people returning to themselves. Richard stands. He reaches into the overhead bin and retrieves his bag, the well-traveled bag of a man who takes flights alone, and usually arrives exactly as alone as he left. He settles it on his shoulder. He looks down at Marcus, who is collecting his things with the unhurried competence of a child who has done this before, who is used to being alone in transit, who knows how to take care of himself in the small, necessary ways. He says, what are you going to do with the story? Marcus zips his backpack, adjusts the strap. Then he looks up and touches the first place ribbon on his jacket, straightens it with one deliberate finger, the way you straighten something you are proud of, the way you make sure the thing that represents you is presenting itself correctly to the world. He says, keep telling it, until everyone knows his name. Richard looks at him for a long moment. He nods. Once. The way people nod when they have run out of words, and the nod has to carry everything the words cannot. And then he steps into the aisle. And the crowd takes him. And he moves toward the exit with a single page of Marcus's research folded carefully in the breast pocket of his jacket, right against his chest, next to his heart, the way you carry the things that have changed you. Marcus watches him go. Then he sits alone for a moment in the emptying plane. The last passengers file past. The flight attendants begin their sweeping and their resetting, the methodical erasure of one flight's particular human accumulation in preparation for the next. The cabin that held this story is already becoming a generic space again, interchangeable, forgetful. But Marcus is not forgetful. He looks out the window at the runway lights, at the ground crew moving in the dark with their signals and their equipment, at the ordinary infrastructure of an ordinary airport on an ordinary night. He thinks about George, about a boy who knew the names of flowers and walked his sister to school and had a laugh his brother could pick out from across a field. about a boy who pointed two girls towards some maypop flowers one afternoon in March and never had an ordinary afternoon again. About a chair that was too big for him. About feet that didn't reach the floor. About a Bible that was the only thing in that building that belonged to him. About a sister, decades later, weeping in a courtroom. About a name that is finally, slowly, finding its way into the world. Marcus straightens the ribbon one more time. Blue and gold. First place.
His.
He picks up his backpack. And George Stinney Jr., executed at 14, exonerated at 84 years posthumous, carried forward tonight by a 12-year-old boy on a night flight and left with a 50-year-old man who will bring flowers to a grave in Alcolu, South Carolina, travels a little further into the world. He travels in the folder and in the memory and in the single page pressed against Richard's chest and in the ribbon on Marcus's jacket and in every person who watches this and refuses to forget. He travels. He is not lost. He is being carried. George Stinney Jr., born October 21, 1929, in Pinewood, South Carolina. Arrested March 1944 for the murders of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames. Tried and convicted April 24, 1944, in a trial that lasted 87 minutes. Executed June 16, 1944, at the South Carolina State Penitentiary. Age at death, 14 years old. Weight at death, 95 pounds. Youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. Exonerated December 17, 2014, by Circuit Court Judge Carmen Mullen, who ruled that his trial was fundamentally unfair. He had an alibi the entire time. He was innocent. His name was George. The question I want to leave you with is this. Marcus is 12 years old. He won a state history competition by refusing to let a dead child be forgotten. Richard is 50 years old. He flew to South Carolina to find the stain his father left him to find. And somewhere in all of this, in the flight and the folder and the ribbon and the name said quietly in the dark, George Stinney Jr. got a little more of the justice that his 14 years deserved. But here is what I need you to sit with. George is not the only one. His story is documented now, examined, ruled on, official. But how many others are there? Children who were taken by systems that had decided their guilt before asking a single question, who had lawyers who prepared nothing and juries who deliberated for minutes and judges who signed paperwork and moved on, whose names we still don't know, whose sisters are still alive somewhere, carrying the weight of what they witnessed and what they lost, waiting for someone to ask, how many George are out there? And what are we doing about it? If this story moved you, please subscribe to this channel. Please share this video. Put it on your page, send it to your family, show it to your children. Because the way George Stinney Jr. finally gets the world he deserved is if people like you refuse to let his story stay quiet.
Subscribe. Share.
And drop his name in the comments, just his name, as a tribute. Let this comment section be full of his name. Let the algorithm see his name so many times it has no choice but to carry him further. George Stinney Jr. Say his name.